Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to build a user table using the shadcn UI library. We've covered shadcn in a previous video on the channel where I introduced 10 different component and UI libraries that I use. We're going to specifically use the table component, which is actually using TanStack Table or React table under the hood to build this user table. We're going to implement or look at how to implement pagination. So if you're paginating through the list of our users, we're going to implement this action row where you would have different actions that you can perform based on the data in this specific row. We're going to implement this sorting so you can sort by name or filter by name very easily. And then at the end, I'm going to also show you how to create this column toggle or visibility toggle where you can select what columns you actually want to see inside of your table. So let's just get right into it. So we're going to start from scratch and build this together. I've just gone ahead and installed or created a new NextJs app by running create next app at latest. We are using Tailwind CSS and TypeScript in the NextJS. You can head to the documentation and there's the installation steps specific to Next.js, where you can actually start by creating a Next.js app before copying or initializing shadcn. Also, I'll include a link to the finished project code on GitHub in the description, so you can have it as a reference and compare it to your own. So let me make this a bit bigger so you can see what we're doing. So I've basically completed the first step, which is creating a Next.js application. Now the next step is actually to initialize the shadcn UI. Now shadcn is not going to install any components of its own. Instead, it's going to actually install Radix UI under the hood because it's using Radix UI, which is basically a headless, accessible React component library that shadcn is using or it's built on top of. And by initializing shadcn, it's basically going to add this component JSON file to your project where it is actually setting up where everything is inside of your component, whether or not you're using the app router, whether or not you're using server components, where is your global CSS, where is your Tailwind config, what style do you want to use, do you want to use TypeScript and whatnot. So it's basically a config setup for how then shadcn can copy different components into your project, which we're going to see together once we start going to the table component. So this is explaining that you're going to go through a bunch of questions. I've already done this, but it's going to, once you run this command, it's going to ask you all the questions that I just mentioned. You can select based on your project, and then it's going to write this component's JSON file as a config. Now the structure in which shadcn is going to create components for you once you use the CLI is actually creating a UI component inside a UI folder inside of your components besides the app folder, as well as a lib folder for a function which is working with Tailwind merge and CSS authorities. Now everything is set up for you to start using shadcn components. For example, if you wanted to use a button, you can use this CLI command, which is going to go and get the code for the component, the button component, and copy that inside your project. Again, we're going to see this in action. On the left-hand side, as you can see, there are different components that comes with shadcn. For example, alert box, dialogues, avatars, menu drop-downs, and whatnot. Today we're working with the data table and we're going to learn how to set this up. But along the way through the process, we're going to also use buttons and drop downs. So you're going to see actually using shadcn UI library in action. Now, one thing to mention before going forward is that this table component from shadcn is actually using the TanStack table or the React table, which was named previously. This is a component, again, a headless API for creating tables. All this functionality that I just showed in the beginning of the video actually comes from the TanStack table, which is basically exposing a bunch of APIs so you can create tables from your data. And we're going to see how we would do this and how we can add these different APIs and functionality to our tables, such as the filter, the sorting, the pagination, and whatnot. And let's head to the installation. So the first component that we're going to install from the shadcn library is the table component. So I'm going to copy this script using pnpm. So I'm going to click on pnpm. This is going to give me the pnpm version of this code. And I'm going to copy this here, which is basically going to copy the table component inside of my app. Let me just close this off and show you what I mean. So inside of our components, there's this UI folder now created and a table.tsx inside of it, which is all the components that actually shadcn is exposing. There are different wrapper components for rendering tables, table heads, table rows, table body, and whatnot. And they already have some styling set on top of them. And that's the good thing about shadcn. It's not a component library in the sense that it just gives you the component. It literally, you can copy the code here, which means that you have more control over the styling or anything that you would really want to change inside of these components. So that was the first step. The second step is for us to actually also install the TanStack React table. Let me just copy the pnpm version as well here. Let's copy this and install the TanStack React table library. This is going to expose a bunch of functions and a specific hook called use React table that gives us all of those APIs that allows us to work with tables. Now, moving on, it's explaining here that in this example on the site, it's going to have a table of different payments. So it's defining the type or the schema or the shape of our payment. We're going to do the same for our users. So let's move down to the project structure. Now, this is how it's recommended here to structure your data. You can do it differently, but basically you have these three different components inside of your payments, or in our case, inside of our users folder. So let me just create this. We want to create a folder here inside of our app directory that's responsible for showing users. Now, the first thing we're going to put inside of it is a page.tsx. This is going to be a server component responsible for rendering our page. So let me just simply add a section here with some padding and a div with a container class and an h1 that says all users. So let me save this. Also close this off. If we now go back to our application and go to /users, this is the page component responsible for rendering /users. Okay, so that's the first step. The second step is to create this columns.tsx, which is another client component that is going to include your column definitions. This is the headers, the cells, and the different formatting that you want to actually have inside of your columns. And the last one is this data table component, which is literally the data table component that uses the shadcn table component under the hood to actually render our data. We're going to take the component from this file, bring it into our server component here, fetch some users, and pass it to this data table component. You're going to see this in action, so don't worry if it doesn't make sense right now. Let's actually move on and create our next file, which is our columns. So I'm going to create the columns inside this user folder as well. So I'm going to create a file called columns, again, .tsx. And let's just copy whatever is in here, and then we're going to change it based on our use case. So we're going to get the column definition, and we're going to define a user shape, which has an ID. It has a name that is a string. It has an email of, well, email was down there, so let's just eliminate this. And it also has an image, which is also a string. It also has a last seen property, which is a date string. Okay, so this is the shape of our data. Now, this is our column definition that I was talking about. Now, each of these objects are going to represent a column inside of your table. So the first one can be the name of our user, and we're going to call this name. The second one, the email, and then maybe on the last, I want to show the last seen field, and then a header of saying last seen. Now, the accessor key is the ID for each column. You can use this key to get values for a specific column and work with the APIs and functions that's exposed from your use React table hook. We're going to see that in action, and the header is literally the string that's going to show up on the header row of your table. Now, there's actually more that we can do with these objects or these definitions. We're going to build on top of this, but for now, let's just keep it simple and move on to actually create our data table component. And then we're going to build on top of these definitions, change the different formatting options or different functions that you have access to here later on. Now, the next file we're going to create is just a data table component. So I'm going to go to my component folder. You can create it inside of this user too. As you've seen here, it's just creating everything inside of this payment. For us, it's the user. I prefer to keep the component, specific components or components inside of the component library. So I'm going to come inside the components. We have this UI table. This is the shadcn. But inside the components itself, I'm going to create a data table or data table like this to keep the same naming convention that shadcn also has. Now, inside of this, we're going to actually copy this and we're exporting a data table component. So from a high level, if I just collapse this, we are rendering a component that is expecting columns and data. It is using this use React table hook from the TanStack library to pass in some data and columns and also get some table object back. And this table object is actually the main object exposing all the APIs from the TanStack table. So as you can see here, for example, we're getting the headers group on the table object, we're mapping over them, and for each header, we're actually showing a row and some t-head or table head cells. We're also using the get row model function, which gives us all the rows inside of our table, depending on the data we're going to pass into this component. Again, we're going to see that in action in a second. Each data point actually is going to be a row inside of your table. So for each row, we're again rendering some table rows and table cells. And if we do not have any data, so the row's length is not truthy, we're just showing a no result cell. Okay, so let's save this out. Now we have our column definition. We have this data table, which is actually getting our columns definition and also the data to render a table. Now the last thing that's left to do is to actually render our table. Now to render our table, we're going to go to our page. This is our server component where we can actually fetch our users and then pass the data down to our data table component. So let me just copy some code and explain what we're doing here. Bear with me for a second. So inside of this page component, which is our /users page, I've added this data table component. We're bringing this in from our component. This is the same component we just created together. And then we're creating this function get users, which is going to call this mock API endpoint. I'm going to actually show this in a second as well. But it's going to get some users, and we're going to pass this data or our users as the data to our data table component. We're also passing in our columns definition. So we have the column definition actually specifying how many columns, rows, and cells and headers we have. And then we're passing the data, which is using the TanStack React library to correctly render a table. Now, before I move ahead, let me just actually show you this mock API website, which I'm using. It's actually a service where you can use to define different shapes of data, and it's going to expose some endpoints for you to fetch your data. You can sign up for an account. It's free. You can create a project. So in this project, I have created 2 resources, one users, and then for each resource, you can also have nested resources or linked resources, for example, users and to-dos and posts. So if you're building applications, this would be very easy to hit this endpoint and actually get those resources. For the purpose of this video, I'm just defining users, and you would define the shape of your user object. You can use the faker.js to actually fill up these different fields that you provide here. And then it gives you or exposes an endpoint where you can call from inside your application to easily get the user data. So very useful tool. I thought to share this also here. So that's the endpoint we're calling from inside of our get users function. This is inside of our React server component. We can turn our page component to an async function, which allows us to await our data right inside of here. Okay, so going back to our page, we should now have all the users, literally returning 100 users to our table. So as easy as creating these 3 different files, which was a page component that we actually is where you're fetching your user data, a data table component, which uses this use React table hook from the TanStack Table library that exposes some API so you can just work with your data on your table. And we had this columns definition file where we actually define the shape of our data and our table. So that was the basic first step. Now let's jump into the next step, which is actually formatting these cells or the data inside of each row or each column. Now, for example, here they are changing or formatting the amount cell because they're rendering some payments to show the $sign. For us, let's actually go to our table. This last scene is a date string. Maybe we can just format this to show a local string. Now for this, all you need to do is to actually go to that specific key or to that specific object for that specific column and pass in a cell key and point it to a function that returns a JSX or a React element. So you can, instead of this strings that we put in here, even for the header, you can pass in a function or a React component. So let me just copy this component that I have created before into this last scene column. So what I'm doing on the cell itself is I'm getting the row information. Again, you're getting a bunch of props inside of these components or functions. You can go to the TanStack Table documentation to actually know what other props or data is passed to this component. But for now, we're getting the row. From the row, we can call this getValue function, pass in the last scene key to get the specific data for this cell. I'm formatting it to a local date string, and then I'm returning this div for that specific cell with some tailwind classes and then showing that formatted data. So if I save this and go back to our application, now you can see this last scene field. It is actually formatted in a local, instead of showing the date string, is showing a local date string. So going back to the steps, this is how you can format different cells or return really whatever you want here. Now in the next step, let's add some row actions. This is the actions that we had at the end of each row with a drop-down menu where you can view, edit, or delete a specific row and those type of actions. So to add that, what we need to do is to actually bring in this component inside of our columns file. So this is our column definition, and we're going to actually add a specific column called actions. And for the cell and for the data, we're going to return this drop-down menu from shadcn to have different options that we can actually do inside that cell. So first things first, let's install this Lucid React component library because it's using some of its icons here. So let me just stop the dev server. Then we're going to also need to install the button from shadcn and the drop-down menu. So let's, on the left-hand side, find the button. I'm going to open this in a new page. So to install the button, we're going to use the CLI command. I'm going to copy the pnpm. Again, this is going to just copy the button inside the UI folder of our project. So if you see here in the component in the UI, we should now have this button added. Let's do the same thing with the drop down menu because it's also used in the actions. So drop down menu, we're going to also copy that code from pnpm. Just clear this out, copy this, and let's also get the drop down menus. Okay, awesome. Let's close this off and run the dev server. Let me actually also close this off. So going back, now that we have these components, we can just copy this part of the code to add this column definition to our columns. So instead of our columns, maybe after the last scene, which is going to come at the end of our row, we're going to actually add another column definition. So up top, let me also import these inside of here. So these are the components we just installed: the button, the drop down menu, and this icon. Now down here, we are creating a new column because we're adding it to our columns array. Now this object has an ID. This is the ID of these actions. And on the cell, on the specific cell on each row, what we want to show is a drop-down menu that allows us to do stuff with that row data. Now we're going to get the user. Now this is another useful function to get the actual user. So in some of your cells, maybe instead of just calling the get value to get that specific row or that specific cell or that specific key, you want to have the object or the data entry or the data point for this whole row, and then manipulate how this cell looks like instead of just getting a specific value. So here we're getting the user object and we can access the user ID on it. Here what they have done is if you click on this copy, it copies the user ID using the navigator object from the browser. It just copies the user ID, and you can do different stuff. For example, we have the user ID here. One of these drop down buttons or items can be to edit the user or actually delete the user. So let's save this up and go back to our app and see this in action. Let me just refresh this. Now, as you can see, we have these action buttons added at the end of each row. Once you click, you're going to see this drop-down menu. The copy user ID is just going to copy that specific user's ID. So if I go to a new page and copy that, you can see the user ID is number 1 here. So that was adding actions or row actions to our table. Okay. Next step, let's add some pagination. Because right now, if we're just showing all of our users, it's 100 users in one page. So how do we go about adding pagination? Well, first, let's get some functions from the TanStack library. We're going to come here, and on top of the core model, we're going to get the pagination row model, and we're going to add this setting inside of our use React table hook. So right below where we're calling get core row models, we're going to actually get the pagination model as well. Okay, that's the first step. Second step is to actually pass in some pagination controls. But before we add pagination controls, which is going to just change pages, if we go back to our app, you could see right now we only have 10 users inside of our table. And that's because by default, the TanStack pagination, it just puts 10 users or 10 records or 10 rows inside of your table. I'm going to show you how you can change that in a second, but let's just add these pagination buttons. We're going to use the table object and the next page and previous page functions on it to navigate between different pages. So let's bring in our button to our table here. And we're going to also add this div at the end of our table. So let me calm down. This is our table here. Let's just wrap this inside of a fragment. And I'm going to copy this pagination section that uses buttons from shadcn. Also put a little comment here that that's the pagination, and that part upstairs is the table itself. Okay, so what we have added is these buttons from shadcn that literally on click are going to call the previous page or next page on the table object that we're getting back from this useful hook. Okay, so going to our page now, you can see these next and previous buttons added, which allows us to easily paginate inside of our table. Now, if you want to add more advanced pagination, there's a section at the end of the documentation that it uses some reusable components from the example that you can see on the page to add more advanced pagination. Let me just show that to you for a second. There's this pagination, and these are using, or these are the code for this tasks example. So on the shadcn site, there's this example page where you have different examples. As you can see here, there's an example for, let me just turn this to light, maybe it's seen better. So this is a table example from shadcn, and as you can see down here in the pagination, we have more stuff here. If I actually make this a smaller, you can see not only we have the next and previous page, but we have these two buttons which goes to the end of our table or to the beginning. It also shows what page you're currently on. It also allows you to change how many records you want to see per page. So if you want to implement that or take your pagination to a more advanced step, you can just go down to that reusable component section at the bottom of the same page and copy the code. Now, next step, let's actually implement sorting. So it's going to be the same concept. We're going to get some type definitions as well as some functions to add the sort functionality. We're going to create a local state for our sort. So inside of our component, let me just come down here and create this local source sorting state, which is an array of different objects we can pass. And then down here, we're going to actually add some options to our hook. So let's add them here. So one of them, similar to pagination, is going to get the sorted model, and the other one is going to just set this local sorting state anytime that the sorting changes inside of our table. We're going to also add this sorting state. So let's just add this here. So this is our table state, and we are adding this local sorting state to the table state. So they're linked or synced together. Anytime this changes, that changes. Anytime that changes, this changes. Now, to make the header cell actually sortable, we have to go to our column definition and change the header from being a string instead to be a function where we can actually include some buttons and some functionality from our column definition this time. So let's do this. We're going to need this drop down. Let's go back to our columns. We're going to actually get another icon from the Lucid React, and we're going to add this header for our name. So inside of name, instead of just rendering a simple string, we're going to return a React component. Again, these components are going to receive different props from TanStack Table library. And specifically here, we're using the column to get the toggle sorting function and sort from ascending to descending for this specific column. Now I'm going to change this to say name, and all we're doing is to add this button that's going to toggle the sorting for that specific column, which is the name. So going back to our table, you can now see this button is added to our name, and when I click on it, it just toggles the sorting, and because TanStack Table already has our data, it just sorts our data. Now let's also see filtering, which is going to be a similar concept. Again, we're going to get some type definitions. So let's go back to our data table. We're going to get some type definitions. and also some functions. This time we're going to get the filter model. We're going to also need the input component from shadcn. We're going to do that in a second. Now that we're here, let's just also define a state, a local state for our filters. We're going to use a state and initialize this to an empty array. Again, these filters can be an array of different objects that is going to have an ID, which is your column ID, and a value for the value of the actual filter that's going to be used against the data in each row. Now down here, we're going to also pass this options to our use React hook. Let me just bring this down here. So we have the on column filter change, again, setting this as state, and we're also getting this get filter row model and passing this function we just imported from up top. Now we're going to also pass in this local state to our table states, similar to sorting. We're going to have the filters as well. And now all we need to do is to add an input and listen to the changes on that input and set that or pass that as a filter for our table. So we're going to come above where the table is. I'm going to include a div, and inside of it, I'm going to render this input, which means we have to also install the input component from shadcn. So I'm going to go to the input again, copy this CLI code for pm. Okay, great. Let's restart the dev server, close this up, and going back to this page, I need to get this input as well. So let me just copy this from our components. So we are also getting the input. Now, if I go back to our application, we should be able to see this input, which is going to allow us to filter our data based on the name. Now, just to actually see what we're doing inside of this input for the value, we're actually again accessing the table object, get the column for, this is actually filtering by email. So let's get the name, because I copied the code from the example they had, and in the example, they're just filtering based on the email. So we're going to get the column name. We're going to get the filter value, which is exposed from your table object. So if there is any filter, we're going to set it as a value. Otherwise, we're just going to default to an empty string. That's the value of our input element up top there. And then down here on change event inside of this input, we're going to get this same column, and instead calling the set filter value and passing the event target.value, which is the actual value that the user is typing in. So if I save this and refresh, let me just also update this to say filter by name. So this says filter by name, and now if I filter, is going to filter by name. Now going back to the docs, the next section is going to be actually changing the visibility of different columns. So let's quickly also implement this. We're going to use a drop-down menu. Let's go to our data table here and get our drop-down menu from shadcn. We've installed this already before, so we don't need to install this. This is again components from shadcn. We're going to create again a local state for the columns or the visible columns. Okay, so we're initializing a local state called column visibility. We're initializing it to an empty object. Let's also get this type from TanStack library. So drop down is there. We initialize the local state. Again, on visibility change, we need to also set some local states. So let's just add it here. And also we want to add this state to our table state. So similar concept, we are having this local state. On change, we're setting this local state and we're passing it as a state to our table. That's the common pattern for using or adding these functionalities to our component or to our table. Now let's get this drop down component and add it to our div here. So we're going to actually have another drop down button. If we go back to the application, this column down here, let's actually make this a flex box. So class name, let's go flex items center and justify between to pass that column there. This is a drop down menu which is going to allow you to select what columns are visible inside of your table and whatnot. Now, as you can see, it's pretty powerful what you can do with these two libraries together. It's giving you a table with all the APIs that you can imagine, and it's also looking nice because of the shadcn library. Now I'm going to let you also go ahead and experiment with this row selection. This is going to give you the ability to select different rows. So for example, in this example that you can see here up top, you can select different rows and perform actions. You can also have this advanced pagination or section at the bottom where it tells you how many rows are selected. I'm going to let you experiment with that, which is going to be this row selection section. Again, there's 3 different steps, but it's a very similar concept to what we have done already to add that functionality to your table. Now, as I mentioned at the bottom here, there's also this reusable component section where it is actually giving you some examples of different headers, pagination, and column toggle that you can see inside of this tasks demo that I showed earlier. So you can take this as an inspiration or use these type of paginations or the headings inside of your tables. Okay, so let's quickly recap what we have learned. We implemented a user data table in NextJs 13 using the app router. We used the shadcn UI library, specifically the table component. And we also learned that it's using the TanStack Table library under the hood, which exposes all the APIs and functionality you need to work with your data and your table, features like pagination, sorting, filtering, and whatnot. And as far as the structure goes, we created 3 different files. We had a server component, a page that was responsible for rendering our /user page. This is where we fetched our user data and passed it down to our data table component we created in the second file. This file was where we're actually using the use React table hook from the TanStack library and shadcn components to actually render this table. We also had a third file, which was our column definition. This is where we define the shape of our data so we can marry the data and the table, the TanStack and the table component from shadcn together to render our table. I hope you found it helpful. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments like always, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.